Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How to Enable Your DevSecOps Initiative with Security Champions. This event is presented in partnership with our friends over at Synopsys. Thanks so much for joining us. We've got a great event lined up for you here. Before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about the format of the webinar. My name is David Davis, and I'll be serving as the host and moderator on the webinar today. We always want these events to be educational, and we welcome your questions there in the questions tab of the audience console. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of the webinar today, so keep those questions coming. We even have a best question prize to help further encourage some questions. I'll talk about that more here in just a moment. But first, I want to call your attention to the handouts, the resources that are available for download there in your audience console. It's there that you'll find a link to the Synopsys guide on introducing security champions to the DevSecOps lifecycle. It's a very well done document. Make sure that you check that resource out. At the end of the webinar today, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $250 gift card. If you're watching this on demand or recorded, of course, that drawing would have already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found right there in the handouts tab. And then, as I mentioned, we also have a best question prize today. This is for an additional Amazon $50 gift card. What this means is that you have to ask a question to be entered into the prize drawing. We'll be selecting the best question after the event and contacting the prize winner then. And with that, it's now time to introduce you to today's expert presenter. Welcome to Jamie Boot, who is a security consultant at Synopsys. Jamie, it's great to have you on. I'll hand it off to you now. Take it away.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Today I'll be presenting on how you can enable your DevSecOps initiative with security champions. But first, I wanted to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Jamie Boot. I am an associate principal consultant in the management consulting practice in SIG. Over my career, I have built 3 software security programs from scratch, and since then I have used those lessons learned from helping clients build their application security programs into helping them build effective plans. And since then, I have built so many more plans. I work with clients to overcome many different kinds of challenges. In a large organization, problems of scale can be some of the toughest problems to overcome. Other issues is that they've been doing application security since it became cool 15 years ago. And their application security processes and their application security tooling isn't keeping pace with the current environment. They aren't able to deal with containers or API security or new technologies, or their tooling isn't responsive anymore because it was built 15 years ago. It might have been a first-generation code scanning tool, and it doesn't have language support for all these new languages. Another issue that I often encounter is silos. So an issue where the application security team works off in a little bubble somewhere, and every time they reach out to developers, it feels like that they always show up with bad news and to-do lists, and they make everyone's life harder. And so that can either lead to an antagonistic relationship or an issue where they get ignored by the developers whenever they reach out. So this can lead to security being involved way too late, where developers don't reach out to application security. And so they're faced with getting the security approval right before it gets out the door. So one of the solutions that I like to bring into my security plans are security satellites or security champions. Other firms may refer to them as security mavens or navigators or a whole bunch of customized titles that are appropriate to the customer. Ideally, because the satellite program needs to be a reflection of the company that's running the program, the name is where it starts. So if you see satellite, think champions, or if you see champions, think mavens, or if you see mavens, think satellite, whichever term works for you. But what a satellite program is a community of developers, QA professionals, security architects, and members of the development community who have been deputized into security professionals. They've been given additional training, they're plugged into a community, they have regular meetings, and they become the embedded security experts, the embedded security professionals in their teams. Lets a firm have secure development at speed with less friction, because having embedded security experts in the team who are all connected to each other and back to AppSec will allow them to reach out to the teams to overcome issues or say, hey, this tool is causing our team way too much friction. And it gives the teams a say in the security processes that they have to follow. They can either work to fix the processes, or if a process is broken to a point that it is too big for a single team to fix, if enough champions speak up about it, it might cause a revamp of the process. And so we found that security champions really ease secure development for an organization. A consistent trend that we found is that security champions have an outsized impact on the application security programs of organizations. We found that of the firms that scored in the bottom 20% of the BSIM, they were doing the fewest amount of BSIM activities or security activities that contribute to security. They were covering the least amount of ground. Only a quarter of them had a security champions program. But at the other end, the firms that were covering the most ground, they were doing the most activities, they had the highest score, 80% of those had champions programs. And this is a real outsized impact, because the security champions activities is only good for a score increase of about 4 or 6 activities, but having these activities allowed firms to do way more. And so we found that mature firms, or firms that are doing more, have a satellite, and they're probably solving more problems and scaling security and able to get to do more. And this is an old trend. This trend dates back almost all the way back to BSIM 1, so 13, 14 years, which is actually older than DevSecOps. So in the DevSecOps lifecycle, we found that there's still a lot of people. Even though DevSecOps is a quicker development through automation, there's still a lot of people involved. So there are people who are responsible for running tools. There are people who are responsible for configuring the tool chains, writing the code, checking the results, and making approvals. And so having people in the right places helps deal with all of these additional bots. And as you've noticed, even though we've automated a lot, there's still a lot of people involved in the development lifecycle. So in order to keep up with this newer, faster environment where code changes daily, you have daily releases, maybe even twice daily, the collaboration between ops and dev and security has maybe led to a reorg that all of these demands haven't replaced the need for the people. So traditionally, we found that a lot of organizations are adopting DevOps. They have a DevOps team and they're rolling out new tools and processes to code contributors and the SSG, where they're working to build a DevOps culture that is more agile, more flexible, develops faster. They're working to take advantage of diverse skills in terms of automation and operations and development in a way that wasn't connected before, and they're using tools to make it all easier. But most people see people within the people process technology as just the SSG and the code contributors. But in our experience, that's just not good enough. Code contributors are focused on building new code and often deprioritize security, or at least see it as an afterthought, where the release is done and a pen test happens or a production scan finds a vulnerability. And then we're not actually taking advantage of DevOps for security. So in order to advance DevOps into DevSecOps, we found that bringing in security champions, stakeholders in the development process who don't treat security as an afterthought, really lets us glue DevSecOps together and bring together this new paradigm that everyone is striving for. If you want to build a successful AppSec program, if you want to build a successful DevSecOps program, if you want to build a successful development program, having a satellite program will help you do all of that securely. So how do we build a satellite program? It doesn't start with launching rockets, despite what the name says. It's all about the people. So we found that when building a satellite program, having it structured for success is absolute key. And the structure is vital. It has to be formalized. It has to be deliberate. If you try to bring together a bunch of people in a room and say, you are now security champions, go be secure, people are just going to look at you and go, now what? And because the way that your organization operates, their business priorities, their drivers, your risks, they're going to be different from organization to organization. And how people report to each other and how people get stuff done is going to be different from organization to organization. So it's important to customize the Security Champions program and make it appropriate or to make it for your organization. But there are a couple of universals. There are a couple of universals that are needed for the success of a Security Champions program. You have to have leadership sponsorship. Without leadership sponsorship, you're going to have a whole bunch of motivated people that aren't going to be allowed to do security. Their priorities, their incentives aren't going to align with that of the Security Champions program, so it's just going to run out of steam like most best effort volunteering organizations. So leadership support, leadership buy-in is absolutely essential. You also have to work with development because you are going to be deputizing developers from the development organization. If you deputize these security champions and they aren't doing things that the development organization needs to do to develop securely, then you're going to get pushback. And so you have to align the security champions' responsibilities with how they develop. The goal with this is to help developers develop securely. And so a security champion's responsibilities have to be a mirror of a developer's responsibilities. So essentially, when you are building this program, it starts with laying the foundation where you write out the guidance, you write out the activities, the roles and responsibilities, the expectations, and you build the training as well. The training is vital. I'll get to that later. But you are essentially laying out all the requirements for your Champions program. The next phase is that you want to pilot and refine this. And getting the Champions program right is absolutely essential because if you are a brand new application security program and you're just getting started, the first contact that you might have with development teams is asking for a security champion. And if they volunteer someone, to them, they think of it as giving up a body because they're not used to doing security, then this ask is really your first introduction to development, and it can be a make or break for that relationship. So getting it right, working with early adopters to build the best champions program where you pilot your initial best guess for what a champions program should be, and then you take in that feedback, you iterate on it until you have a documented program that works really well for the early adopters. And once you have that, you begin to collect your metrics, you begin to tell stories, and you go on a socialization push where you get buy-in from leadership. You go to leadership and say, hey, I built this really cool thing. I'm having this really good impact, and I'd like to scale it. And then you can go to development and say, hey, I have these wins, and so you're going to have to do all of these security things moving forward because we're going to do security now, and security is part of your jobs. By the way, I have a really cool program that can take one of your developers, give them really good security skills and professional skills around security, and connect them in, and they'll be your security expert. So this is a chance to have a security expert on your team, someone that you can go to who can then come to us if there are security issues, or they can answer the security questions on the spot. We'll give them training. When you're laying the foundation, when you're piloting, when you're scaling, you really want to take a holistic approach. You want to not say we need to just solve this one problem with champions. We need to address multiple problems, and you can use your security champions program to get some real strategic wins, such as building a champions program will also help you build a better training program, because the champions will be the first group to come into contact with the training, and they'll give you plenty of feedback, believe me. But it also helps with putting security tools in the hands of developers, and they'll also be the ones to tell you if your security tools aren't as effective as they should be. So additionally, when you are building your champions program, having the right size of the security champions program will also lead to success, because the amount of involvement, the number of champions that you ultimately have, is going to be a reflection of how much effort the organization is going to put into security. If you're going to automate everything away, then you might have a lighter touch. If you are going to get very people-centric, where you have a very deep reach into development teams, then you're going to need more security champions who are doing more. And the size of the program, the size of the commitment, the size of the responsibilities are going to vary from organization to organization. So to kick things off, during the phase one, if you want to build a security champions program, you have to generally have a good definition, and you don't want to leave phase one without some degree of senior leader buy-in. You want to have at least permission to do this. You don't want to do it as like a shadow program. And so working with leadership early and often is a great way to make sure that when you come back with the larger organizational asks, they'll have your back. If you can say, hey, I want to build this program, I think it'll be really good for security, they're going to expect to see a return on an investment. So when you set your goals, gather information and define a program. Make sure that the way you define the program is measurable, so that way you can measure and report on success. Get with leadership, get with development, get with other key stakeholders, architecture, tools, QA, testing, if you have security testers, to gather information and look at what they're already doing, because you might be able to identify processes and tasks that they're having to handle that security champions might be able to make easier. If you have architects doing design reviews, then having security champion representatives from the teams could help them with gathering data for their design reviews. Next, you need to understand how the champions will interact with the SSG and the development organization. Are they going to be deeply embedded in the development organization with a light touch from the SSG? Are they going to be largely independent? Or is the SSG going to have a bigger impact? Are they going to be more responsible for managing them? So once you have an idea of what the different stakeholders need and what they do, and how the security champions will fit into the overall organization, you need to define the champions program. We like to build a program charter that has the roles and responsibilities for the security champions program. Next, build a roadmap. Talk about how you're going to pilot, how you're going to deploy, how you're going to scale. And if you want to mature your champions program and expand out the responsibilities after you get those early wins, build it into a roadmap. Be deliberate about it. And finally, build that metrics framework. This is an oversight that we see a lot of organizations really struggle with. And because it's hard, it gets skipped really often. The metrics framework isn't just so that way you can report up numbers. It's so that way you can communicate wins. It's so that way you can tell a story about, hey, we took the security champions, we gave them training, we asked that they take ownership of a couple of security tasks within teams. And by the way, since we've done this, our measurements have shown that they've really had an outsized impact. They've made security easier or more effective, or lowered friction, or reduced the amount of time that vulnerabilities stay open, or reduced the amount of time that it takes to fix a vulnerability. So having a deliberate metrics framework is also key to having a successful champions program, especially early on, because this is a common pitfall where teams are pretty good at defining it. They have good roles and responsibilities. They have a solid roadmap. They have good guidance, and they've built something that looks like it would work on paper, and they hit a roadblock when they can't expand. They don't have the metrics to communicate the wins. During the phase one, you want to socialize the program charter and the roadmap, but you're also collecting the metric, or you're also predicting the metrics that you can use to measure your success. So we like to say that this should take about 6 to 8 weeks, because you'll be meeting with people, you'll be drafting, you'll be getting buy-in, you'll be communicating, and so this isn't something that you could necessarily do in a week. So about 2 months, and then you should have early adopters. You should be looking for people. And who is going to typically be involved in a Security Champions program? So obviously you have the program lead. Someone has to own a program. If you don't have a single person or team that owns the Security Champions program, it's not going to have a clear vision, and it's really not going to progress beyond a group of people who are all interested in security. So a program lead is also going to ensure that the champions are being champions and not slacking off. The common failure mode for a security champions program is essentially the silent failure, where security champions, they get the training, they're plugged in, and they just go silent because no one's following up on them, making sure that they're dealing with vulnerabilities and that they're performing their responsibilities. And so there has to be some sort of a tracking in place to make sure that security is still being handled at the program level. Additionally, there should be some sort of a community forum or Slack channel or some way for the developers or for the champions to communicate with each other. And finally, they track progression. So we recognize that certification medals or belting levels are fairly common, but really there should be a way to reward champions for their participation. And a program lead may be all that you need in a small organization. I have personally run a champions program of about 20 security champions, but if I were to get more than that, I would begin to need either security coaches or security leads to help me scale. The program lead will reach out and look for people with experience in leadership. These are either leaders within the Security Champions program. They may be someone who is also in a leadership role in a business unit that all of the business units security champions report up through. And they may be in a supervision role. And then you can also have security coaches, and these are like mentors. These are people who have experience, and they might be higher level security champions who take on less experienced security champions and just coach them in a professional development way. But really, this is a way of scaling your leadership of your security champions program. If you have a very large program, if you have 500 security champions, that's like managing a small or medium business of 500 employees. And you wouldn't just have one boss for a small business. You'd have a bunch of managers. And so having security leads or security champions leading other champions in the program is vital to scale. And finally, you have the security champions. When we have the security champions, we look for people. They most often come from the development environment, development QA or architects. They primarily work to make sure that first, the AppSec requirements are understood within their teams so that they're not just being surprised by security requirements. Oh, I have to do a test. Oh, I have to fix this. They're working to help their team proactively meet those requirements by making sure that their teams are at least aware of it. The champions may also help with defect discovery. If there are local tooling that's integrated into the pipeline, they might operate the tools and help triage the results. And they're also a security advocate in the development environment. So they may mentor peers in security and raise the general level of security awareness. When you're building the security champion roles, what you need to keep in mind is that they are an embedded security resource. So they're there. The security champion is there when sprint planning happens to ensure that security issues aren't pushed out of the backlog. They might also be responsible for iterative threat modeling, where every time that they update the design, they've been exposed to enough threat modeling training that they go, hey, we're opening up this new functionality, we should bring in this new security control. They're also going to eventually become the local automated security testing tooling experts. So they're going to understand your SaaS tool. They're going to be the people that come, or they're going to be the person that developers come to when there's a when there's a problem with the tooling. They can also drive vulnerability management and remediation, recognizing that, yes, this is a problem, this is a big problem, here's how we fix it, or this is a smaller problem, here's how we can prioritize it to make sure it's fixed eventually. And finally, there needs to be this two-way flow where they advocate for the team needs and reduce that friction. So by plugging the security champions into that community, they can be the conduit for the AppSec team to get feedback from the field. And that feedback can be valuable in making application security easier for development without losing its ability to mitigate risk. So with all these roles and responsibilities, it's important to have good selection criteria in place. When you're looking for security champions, ideally you're looking for someone who's already a leader in the work center, maybe not a manager, not the team lead, but someone that the developers, the QA team looks to already for guidance. You want them to have that authority so that way when they advocate for security, people listen. So generally, that's why we say someone with 3 to 5 years of experience, because if you give them to the most senior developer, they already have so many things on their plate that adding another responsibility means that they're not going to be able to give them enough time. But if you give it to the most junior guy, then they're going to be ignored, essentially. They're not going to be able to advocate for security within their teams. Additionally, we want people with strong communication and organizational skills because they're going to be going peer-to-peer. They're going to need to prioritize security efforts within their team. And so there's a degree of management experience that's required, but it's not official management experience. Ideally, we like them to be excited about application security. Oftentimes people come to us and say, how can I get into application security? And oftentimes the Security Champions program will be the first step in that. So this is a way to get them the skills and training and experience that they need to move further into security if that's what they want to do. After you have your initial group of security champions identified, you want to conduct an inaugural pilot where you are essentially building out a security champions program with between 10 to 20 security champions. You're giving them the training, and then you collect the feedback and use that to improve the larger program. If they say, hey, I wasn't able to do this responsibility, then maybe you might need to bring in additional training or documentation. If they're also exercising your tools and the tools aren't working for them, you can also use this to improve the larger application security program as well. So during this plan, you want to run the initial training boot camp. You want to begin to collect those security metrics, because after the pilot phase 2, you're going to go on a roadshow and say, hey, using 10 people, using 10 security champions, we were able to have all of these wins. And it might take 6 to 8 weeks. It could go longer, depending on how long it takes people to get oriented, how long it takes them to get the training, how long it takes them to get comfortable. But this is where you are essentially prototyping out your champions program, and you're building the model that you're going to scale and extend. I want to bring up training. It is absolutely vital that security champions have training, because what differentiates a developer who wants to do security to a security champion is that they know how to do it. If you give a developer a tool, they're a developer with a tool. But if you enable them to run the tool, act on the results, and overall improve security using that tool, then that's the hallmark of a champion. And we found that having a larger training strategy is key. So e-learning is lightweight, but developers can click through. It's good for refreshing, and it's also good for people who are self-motivated who maybe want to brush up on security training. We found that developers almost universally positively respond to instructor-led training, especially if there are hands-on portions. When you are bringing developers into the same room, letting them work with each other, letting them talk, these can be the early stages of bonding that builds a security champions program, and it can happen in the classroom. Additionally, a security champions program needs to have custom training, and this can be training that incorporates elements from the company's history. If there was an incident or if there was a problem, learning from it is, we found, to be the stickiest and best way to have lessons learned where, hey, this happened to us last year. Do you all remember it was really bad? Do you want to hear more about it and how to prevent it? And everyone's go, yeah, I want to hear about that. The champions program can also deliver custom training as well, but this tends to be training about processes and tools, where if you go out and you buy an off-the-shelf tool, there's plenty of training about it, but is there training in how to use it in your pipeline and in your organization? So the Champions program will oftentimes have shorter blurbs of training, maybe 5-minute presentations. Hey, this process is coming. Fill out this form. These are what the forms need. Send it to this person. And that could be the whole of the training, just clarifying when it needs to happen, how often, and what people need to do. And so the training can be delivered to the champions or can be delivered by the champions. And finally, you want your champions to have a product training. So they're the ones who are going to initially undergo the vendor training. If you go out and you get a new tool from a vendor, oftentimes your security champions are going to be the ones that are going to get the hands-on instruction from the vendor engineers. And so they're going to be the people who work to customize the tool and define how it'll be run. So during the onboarding and configuration process, we like to bring in the security champions because this is going to be their day-to-day. We found that if you're buying a tool and you aren't bringing the security champions into the process, it's going to be a problem. So it's going to be just something that either never runs or it's going to be a noisemaker. Something else that you have to consider is that a security champions program needs upkeep. It needs additional nurture and care. The program lead can't just go out and nominate a bunch of people and only reach out when there are problems or when there are tasks. You want to have a regular meeting where the security champions meet up and they get to talk to each other. They get to have additional visibility into what's going on in the larger business. Additionally, your management of the security champions program has to have the metrics. You have to continue to show the wins and the impact that your security champions are having. So that way it stays front of mind, because if you aren't reminding people, hey, we have this thing, it's really cool, we should keep maintaining it, no one's going to maintain it. Additionally, you want to continue to deliver new and diverse training to continue to grow the tool sets, because the security champions are going to be there and they're going to become the holders of the security knowledge inside of your organization after a while. And the way that they do that is through those different trainings. You can also go to industry experts and say, hey, I have a security champions program. Would you be willing to give a presentation to them? And oftentimes security experts love to say, hey, I'd love to give a talk. And they will expose your security champions to security topics that might be relevant, but also might be interesting. Oftentimes, if you have an expert in containers or APIs or AI and machine learning, having them come in and give a talk, even though that technology might not be present or widely available in your organization, is still interesting because it gets people thinking about security in a new way. Additionally, having something like hackathons or other community events inside can also reward security champions for being champions. So really, you have to have a long-term plan for your security champions program. Otherwise, it's going to fall apart. And so it's that metrics and reporting, it's that management and upkeep, and it's that skill growth that is going to have the long-term impacts in terms of the overall security culture in your organization. But the engagement is going to make sure that security champions don't just fade away. If people feel forgotten, they will tend to gravitate towards areas where they're not forgotten, where they can feel valued and important. And so continually work to engage your security champions, give them talks, give them events. So earlier I said that metrics was hard and overlooked. And oftentimes companies come to me and say, hey, Jamie, what do I need to report on? How can I build my metrics program? And the metrics that I tell them come in three main buckets. First, you need to measure how the program itself is doing. You need to start by measuring how many dev teams have a security champion, how far the developers are into their training, and how often you are educating them through something like brown bags or special talks or the live events. Additionally, you want to measure the impact. And so one impact metric that I'd like to call out is the adoption metric. And you can show how having security champions on a team helps with tools, SAST and DAST. If it's integrated into a team's pipeline, chances are having a security champion there is going to increase the adoption. And overall, you want to measure teams that do have security champions versus don't, and you're going to measure it on the impact metrics, defect density versus development velocity, critical open vulnerabilities, and the mean time to remediate. So reporting on those and showing the impact of security champions will also help you get buy-in if you want to expand or improve the champions program. After you have your pilot, you've taken your 10 developers and minted them into champions, you've given them training, you've had them be champions for a little bit, you've applied the refinements to the program, you now have something that's ready to scale. So armed with your metrics, you go up to leadership and say, hey, this is what I want to scale, this is the ask, and here's the impact that it'll have. So you want to get permission, you want to get buy-in, where senior leadership then goes to the development environment, goes to business units and says, hey, Security Champions program is coming, I believe in this, it's going to have these impacts, it's time to adopt. You want to begin to reach out to managers who are aware, so you want to socialize that the Champions program is coming. You want to have it socialized from the top down, but also horizontal. So as an AppSec team, you're reaching out, you're notifying people, hey, we're going to need a security champion from your team. And so that way, when you show up, they're like, yeah, I thought about your request, and I think Bob and Alice would be great. During the scaling process, generally, this is where your Champions program builder and their administrator may be two different people. You might have needed a more senior expert to define the security roles and help get it going, but you might have a critical mass of expertise with your initial champions that you can have a program administrator who's a more junior role, who's involved in tracking and the day-to-day, making sure that there's champions assigned, that they have the training, that they're doing the tasks, and they only reach out to the program lead for escalation or for vision. Additionally, this is when you are bringing in your security champion coaches. They've worked with the initial team, or they might have been members of the initial team of security champions. And so you're putting them in contact with the new security champions and using them to help scale through training and mentoring. This is also where you are scaling through the use of reusable IP. If you have runbooks, if you have checklists, if you have templates, you are not only providing these to the champions, but you're also giving them an overview of what they contain and how to use them. So after you scale, you should be scaling to the point that you operationalize. So I'd like to take a couple minutes and talk about security champion programs that we've seen in the field. They've gone through this approach. They started out by laying the foundation, then they piloted, and finally, they scaled it into something successful. So I have two case studies for you. The first is an insurance industry giant. I'm sure you've heard of this company. I'm sure you've seen their insurance commercials. But really, they were having a problem scaling security across the entire organization. So they were only able to get 10% time commitment from developers. The majority of the time was spent as the developers, and there were a lot of them. So there were 200 plus mavens and only one person to manage the program. So instead, what we did was we came in and built a more deliberate security training program. We instilled the security culture through training and community and management, and got with their leadership to incentivize participation. We also made sure that the champions were able to talk directly to tool experts, and really worked to embed remediation guidance assistance into the tooling, into the processes, so that way when they got a result back, it wasn't just a problem, it was a problem and a solution. So based on this, they improved their security awareness across the board. They also used this to scale DevSecOps adoption across the SDLC and successfully integrate culture, processes, and tools, and we're able to do security at speed without compromising development. As an aside, the way that they got senior leadership was through metrics. There was a regular briefing where we would report up slides to the CISO, and the CISO had meetings where he was getting briefed from a lot of different departments and a lot of different organizations. And so using the metrics, we were able to communicate a story about how the security champions were having an outsized impact. And he turned to the owner of a business unit and he said, "Do you know the names of your security champions? Because you should." And then after that, the adoption of security champions and all of the recommendations really took off because they demonstrated value and got the top-down support and that top-down visibility through the metrics. Another time, we met with a telecommunications company. So they had a problem where they had an absolutely huge development community. They had thousands and thousands of teams, thousands of applications, and so they didn't have enough people to devote at the 10% level, because if one person can successfully manage about 40 people, and then you have thousands of potential security champions, you're going to need potentially hundreds of managers. So instead, in order to reduce the management commitment, they turned people into full-time security champions, where it was 100% their job, but they were embedded in the development teams. They didn't report back to the security team, they reported through the dev environment. So they were essentially developers who were turned into security professionals, but they didn't report to AppSec. They didn't report to Ops. They were developers. And so all of their time was spent performing security activities, and they were able to cut the amount from hundreds of security champions down to about 50 of them. And it only took about 3 FTEs to manage all of those security champions. Essentially, by working to automate the security activities throughout the SDLC, improve that remediation guidance, again, having solutions, not just problems, and an outreach program that raised security awareness among the developers. So again, firm results, 80% reduction of critical OWASP vulnerabilities within 8 months. Again, that amount of movement in an organization with thousands and tens of thousands of developers is huge. And they were also able to increase tool adoption and make sure that the training that they developed, because again, training to thousands of developers, if you have 1 hour of training across 1,000 developers, that's 1,000 hours you're spending, which is a huge investment. And so by using the security champions to vet the training and make sure that only the most actionable training was being delivered to the champions, they were maximizing the impact of that training and making sure that the training asks had the biggest impact, which again led to that 80% reduction of critical OWASP vulnerabilities. So I will now be addressing questions in the chat, and thank you all for coming to my talk.
All right, great presentation, Jamie. Really appreciate that. I learned a lot. I know the audience did as well. We got some great questions coming in. I want to encourage everyone out there, if you have a question, now's the time to get your question in. Also, don't forget about the link there in the handouts tab for additional information. It's an excellent resource on introducing security champions to the DevSecOps lifecycle. So let's see. First question here. I'll go ahead and just start with this one from Brandon in Utah, who's asking, what's the best way to get buy-off for something like this from management? Jamie, what's your advice on that?
Okay, so to start things off, because the Security Champions program is such a reflection, or it has to be a reflection of the AppSec program it supports, the developers who are building software. Really, the best answer to this is, pick out the best way to communicate to your leadership. So when you are pitching this, you can have a couple of different approaches, but I've found that really like listening to and understanding what management wants from a security champions program or what they value is vital in crafting that message. So a couple of things that I've seen work really well, though, are, you can come up with the outcomes. You can be very targeted and say, we're going to take a bunch of developers, we're going to invest in them as people, and in return, we expect to see, reduced mean time to remediate vulnerabilities and decrease in vulnerabilities introduced, and all of these efficiency benefits if your senior leadership cares about efficiencies. If your senior leadership cares about security, then it's a really easy sell, where you can say, hey, we're going to take more people and equip them to do security. And I have seen only in one instance a very technical breakdown of how the Champions program win some over. So it did work once, but that wouldn't be my go-to. So understanding how to motivate your senior leadership, how to get that upwards delegation, those soft skills going, is a good way to sell it. But really, I think that, when you are selling any security thing to non-security focused people, the most effective message is, hey, you really want to do A, B, and C, and I want you to do A, B, and C securely and quickly with as minimal of an impact, and this is a great way of doing so. So lining up that message might be your strongest play.
Excellent. I like that wise advice. I like the educational angle there to that as well. So well said. Let's see. Here's another good question. This one is from Joe. Joe's asking, how should we enforce the corporate policies from the top down or from the bottom up through the champions?
Yes. So I think that, I approach, policy enforcement, policy, compliance as something that really has to happen from every direction. There has to be some sort of a grassroots movement from either security champions or developers who are motivated and incentivized to, to undergo and do security things. There needs to be that sideways approach from the application security team, from the security teams who are supporting their peers and communicating and kind of leading from the trenches. And, there also has to be that top-down support. And without really all three of those, the overall compliance, the overall policy buy-in is going to be less effective, because if you just have senior leadership who says, okay, we need to be secure, and they believe that they can snap their fingers, and they don't communicate that downward, then it's just a bunch of binders that are printed out and stored on shelves. No one really follows them. If you don't have, or if you have a grassroots movement, but they don't have permission to do it, then they're going to be forced to prioritize what their managers and what leadership prioritizes. And so if there aren't any, if there isn't any room on that priorities list, then the grassroots movement is eventually going to, kind of dwindle out. I've seen that happen a lot of times with volunteer-based security champions programs, where you have a lot of motivated developers who are saying, we're going to, get together and, do security, do policy compliance, but they kind of peter out after a while because they don't get that top-down support. They hit that brick wall where they don't get the buy-in, they don't get the support to kind of formalize what they're doing into something. And so it is from every direction, in my opinion.
Yes, well said. You got to get buy-in at every level to be successful. I like that. Here's another good question. Let's see, they're asking, or they say, sorry, someone needs to be responsible for the program. Help me understand how to approach the staffing needs. Any advice there?
Okay. Right. So one figure that we throw around is, in the BSIM, we have observed, we go in and we count how many champions do you have versus how many developers. And if you crunch the numbers, it's about a 1 to 10. And so if you only have, or if one champion to 10 developers, and if you only have a handful of security champions because you have 100 developers and 10 champions or something like that, then you run in, or then you don't run into, staffing problems. You just, you go get permission to recruit those 10 individuals, add it to their job description or job roles, work it into the backlog tasks, and you can manage it with one person part-time from a security team. But in instances where you have 50,000 developers, you have to get really creative with that because you're dealing with, potentially hundreds or thousands of security champions. And when you get into like 50 to 500, that's like running a small or medium business. And so you have to take into account the management. So I like to line up, the security champions management as something that aligns with the business unit management. So if you have management chains within the individual business units, taking those people and saying, okay, here's how you manage champions. Can you manage these champions to get the buy-in? And then you manage those people, and you have that multi-layered approach as well. But really, you have to put on your entrepreneur hat and, think like a small business owner.
Yeah, I like that, thinking like a small business owner. And here's an interesting question. Laura is asking, are champions compensated, or what's their motivation for being a champion?
Right. So again, everyone is motivated by different things. Some people are motivated by recognition. I have heard that, the more senior champions, if they do have a level like the level 2, level 3 champions, might get like a little cyber ninja icon in their Outlook thing. So when you look them up to send them an email, you see that there's like a little cyber ninja badge. And so that's one incentive to get people interested and, kind of proud of the work that they're doing. Other times, if you write it into their job requirements where they get evaluated and incentivized, their annual bonus, their, raises, the job performance is also incorporating this, that's a good way to formalize it and, get the security champions really written into the job responsibilities as, as deeply as software development. Additionally, there are other ways you can do gamification where you put teams in competition with each other, or little spot bonuses. It can be even like a little $5 Starbucks gift card handed out. So again, this depends on how your company incentivizes people on the whole. I would tap into those channels, and find ways to recognize both financially, but also maybe not, that recognition is free. All it takes is time and a few kind words. So you have a lot of different options.
Got it. Okay. Here's another interesting question. They're asking about monitoring. How do I know, how my DevSecOps initiative is going? Any advice on that?
Right. I mean, really, I think that a lot of people, kind of get metrics a little bit wrong, where the metrics shouldn't be a chore because they shouldn't just be numbers and flat things that you're reporting up. You should always start with a story. I want to do something. Am I going to do it well? How do I know if I'm doing well? Then using the metrics to say, if we have a security champion on this team, then the new defects are going down, or our mean time to remediate, or our release time is, going in a certain direction. And by measuring how a security champion can help good metrics be better and help bad metrics be lower, then then you can use those to tell the stories and report back and say, I have hard numbers about how the Security Champions program, how the DevSecOps transformation is going. So really, whenever you're doing any sort of deployment effort or transformation effort, you should always approach it like a science experiment and build a way to measure the progress as you're deploying.
Got it. I like that. Measuring along the way and adjusting and remeasuring again, a constant, never-ending improvement, if you will.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, Jamie, this has been really excellent. I've learned a lot about this topic. I know the audience did as well. Thank you so much for being on the webinar today.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you to everyone out there in the audience for joining us. We could chat about this all day, but I'm afraid we're running out of time here in our webinar slot. I do want to take a moment to remind everyone to check out the handout tab, and it's there that you'll find a link to a really nicely done resource entitled Introducing Security Champions to the DevSecOps Lifecycle. You can check that out. You can download it. Very graphically beautiful to look at, so make sure that you check out that resource. And then finally, before we go, I should announce the winner of our Amazon $250 gift card. This is going out to Regina Pratcher from Washington, D.C. Congratulations, Regina Pratcher from Washington, D.C. We'll reach out to you, and we'll also be reaching out to our Best Question prize winner as well. Thanks for all the great questions on the webinar today. And of course, finally, thank you to For Synopsys for supporting the webinar. I encourage you to visit their website and again, check out their handout there in the handouts tab. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.